and I'm running for CD18 U.S. Congress. I originally moved to Florida in the late 50s when my dad ended a 27-year career in the U.S. Marines. I went to high school in Florida. I went to Florida State University. After that, I joined the Navy and began a 20-year career in the Navy, including a year in Vietnam. After getting off of active duty, I went to the Harvard Business School and achieved an MBA. Thereafter, I went to Philadelphia for 15 years where I worked in money management. I then decided to become an entrepreneur in Florida, moved to Florida, started a company from scratch, 4 employees, and about $5 million under management. 15 years later, we had 50 employees, and we had $3.5 billion under management. I live in Jupiter with my 14-year-old twins, Mason and Reagan, and my wife, Sharon. I did serve in the state legislature, and instead of telling you about what I'm going to do, let me tell you for a moment what we did do that has impacted the citizens of this district. First of all, portability. People can now live in the house they choose to live. They have the freedom to live in the house they choose without a heavy tax burden. It was a battle I fought for 6 years. And when it was put on the ballot, 64% of the people throughout the state, 67% of the people in South Florida voted for my portability proposals. And every day someone says, I now live because of portability where I want to. Secondly, I worked with Jeb Bush. We brought the Scripps Research Institute to the district, and that helped with Torrey Pines and Knox Pine. But finally, I was the only one in this panel, for example, that fought digital domain. I spoke to your BDB board director. I volunteered to speak to your council, and I documented why this was a failed idea that would cost the city significant money. The CEO of Digital Domain had run 2 companies before. One went in bankruptcy, and one went out of business. Had I been listened to by Charlie Chris, you would not be paying taxes on an empty building.
Mr. Schlesinger,
Left the Republican Party and joined the Democratic Party. One of the reasons was because of his belief in the promise of Obamacare. He stated repeatedly in debates how this was a plan that was going to afford everyone access to health care at lower cost. At those times, the promises were out there. The promises that there would be no taxes as part of Obamacare. The Supreme Court said it was a tax proposal. The promises you can keep your doctor. Now even the president has admitted you can't keep your doctor. Well, maybe if you're willing to pay a whole lot more, you can keep your doctor. The promise that you can keep your policy. That's turned out not to be true unless you're willing to pay as much as twice more. And finally, the promise that the average family would have a $2,500 reduction in their premium payments. In fact, with the deductibles of up to $6,000 to $8,000, as Beverly just said, the typical middle-class family cannot afford this scheme. But more importantly, over the long run, it will inhibit technology, the technology that made ours the greatest healthcare system in the world. Yes, the congressman now says we need to mend it. But by mending it, all he wants to do is postpone the adverse consequences. Postpone it until he wins re-election. It is interesting that this bill, which passed some years ago, most of the adverse consequences only came into effect after Obama won re-election. This is a horrible bill. It needs to be repealed.
Mr. Schlesinger, what would you support to make sure?
Your question is absolutely incorrect. There was never an abolishment of the Voters' Right Act by the Supreme Court. They simply said the Voters' Right Act is still legal except for one section. You cannot state which, you cannot say what counties or state need pre-clearance, from the Justice Department based on 50-year-old statistics. Because what was happening, places where there were no discrimination, where minorities were voting in higher proportions than whites, were still having to get pre-clearance up in Washington, D.C. You know the League of Women Voters, and I supported the Fair Districts amendment in the state a couple of years ago. But just this week, a minority's congressperson's seat in the federal government being jeopardized by that legislation. I believe minorities need to be represented, and I believe the Voting Rights Act still exists. And where there's signs of discrimination, it should be fully enforced. But the Voters' Rights Act was not declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court last year.
A bill that would reinstate key provisions of the Voting Rights Act is moving through Congress. provisions?
Well, if those key provisions say that we should use 50-year statistics, 50-year-old statistics to reach the same conclusions, then I would not support those provisions.
Mr. Schlesinger. There's been Indian River Lagoon. Part of the solution may be local, part of the solution is in Congress and federal. How would you address the Lake Okeechobee overflow problem and help clean up the Indian River Lagoon?
Thank you. I'm going to go back for 10 seconds because the fundamental right of voting is so important to me. There is a group that's discriminated against on voting, and that's soldiers and sailors that are stationed overseas. In the 2000 election, if a postmark was not the day before the election, that vote was disallowed. That's wrong. When you're out in the far boonies, when you're on a ship, sometimes the mail takes a little longer, sometimes the mail clerk doesn't stamp the date. I would propose legislation to ensure that the votes are acted through the military are actually counted. When I was in the state legislature, I led the fight and was commended for raising monies for the Lake Worth Lagoon and the Loxahatchee River. The plan of CERT, which actually happened before I got in this legislature, was a joint commitment by the federal and the state government to spend around $7 billion to solve some of these issues. The state government religiously, and I didn't lead on this, I just voted for it, got the money to do those kinds of things. The federal government has failed us. Even this year, where perhaps the federal government's going to give us a few $1 million, Senator Negron has gotten over $200 million to meet the state's obligations. We need, first of all, to exactly find out what the issues are. Now remember, the release from the dikes is the Corps of Engineers. That's not a state issue, that's a federal issue. Our congressman has not been talking to the Corps of Engineers about ending those releases. But there's work going up at Harbor Branch at FAU with their logos and other equipment, scientists to find out exactly what is causing the problem, because some of these problems didn't exist 8 or 10 years ago. So we need to do what any doctor would do. Let's diagnose the problem, find out what it is, and then as appropriate, our congressmen and our local representatives need to find the funding to resolve those problems.
Mr. Schlesinger.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a few years, as Beverly says, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, has always been our Constitution. But just a few years ago, the Supreme Court clarified that that was an individual right. You have an individual right, not a collective right, to bear arms. I support that decision. While I served in the state legislature, and I would point out, just to echo what my friends have said, you look where the staunchest gun laws are, places like Chicago and Washington. You also find the murder rate, the victim rate, as high as any place. Because guess what? It's almost a cliche. The bad guys will get the guns whether you do a background check on them or not. I was in the state legislature for 8 years. I think every time I ran, I got the highest ratings from the NRA and the sportsmen. And let me just talk for just a few seconds about two of the significant initiatives we did that revolved around the ability to bear arms. One is the famous Stand Your Ground law. We passed a law in this state that repealed the duty to retreat. If someone approached you in a way that you felt was threatening to your life or serious bodily injury, you had the right to use whatever force. You didn't have to turn tail and run. Now, oddly enough, although that's been criticized by liberal politicians, that is the law in most of the states. Secondly, we enhanced the castle doctrine. I simply don't believe anyone else has a right, unless invited, to be inside your house. And if you're a gun owner and someone's in your house, I think you have the right to use that gun to alleviate that situation.
Next question, we'll start with Mr. Wilkerson.
Last year I had an occasion to do a research project on campaign financing, and go back to the 1800s when 5 or 6 guys raised 25% of the money for a presidential candidate. It's always been an issue, and I keep hearing it from usually the left wing of the party. The reason why it's the First Amendment, freedom of speech, is because the most important and fundamental thing to our political society is that every political opinion be able to be heard. We don't want to shut down anything. We do limit, by the way, a contribution that any individual can give. We just don't limit what you can spend. It's interesting to point out, after rhetorically supporting campaign finance reform for some year as a state legislature and as a senator, Barack Obama was the first president the first candidate, excuse me, that turned his back on public matching funds when he found out he could raise more money than the limits allowed. There's a lot of hypocrisy in this thing. And where does the big money come from? Well, most people think it comes from big businessmen. But no, it comes from big labor. It comes from MoveOn.org, George Soros. That's where the money comes from. As Beverly says, we need to put our message out. We do. But the media self-admits that they're 90% liberal. How do we buy, without money, the answers to their editorials that say we're right-wing kooks? We should have that money. In Florida, there's one thing I would advocate, though, and we do this in Florida. I think it's a great idea. Once your campaign is over, the campaign account should end. In Florida, if you collect, for example, $50,000, you have no opponent, that money goes back. And the same after the campaign. And finally, I'll say, if you think money matters, ask John Corsine, ask Aaron Kenner. Ideas matter.
Mr. Sessom.
Well, since
I'm pleased to join my fellow Republicans. In fact, welcome Beverly. 2 years ago, she was running against our Republican candidate as an independent. And in fact, just the other day, she said she would be all for the high-speed line if it would move a little bit west. So maybe she ought to rethink her criticism of me and tell us what she would do for us. The most important thing to being a representative is to be close to your constituents. One of the honors I got was we have delegation meetings in our 8 years. I was commended as one of the few that never missed the delegation meeting. And talk about fighting. It's hard to fight when your leadership is on the other side. It was not easy for me to go into Marco Rubio's office and tell him I was going to vote against his tax proposal that would essentially double the sales tax on our citizens. And it wasn't real fun to tell Marco and, to tell Governor Chris, who was a Republican governor at the time, that I thought that digital domain was one of the really dumb ideas that I'd heard. I didn't do it just out of, that's the way I felt. I showed him documentation. I showed his office documentation. This guy had failed in 2 businesses. I don't know why Patrick Murphy is supporting All Aboard Florida, but like Calvin said, Patrick Murphy 3 years ago was a Republican. 3 years ago, he started at change parties to run in a district south of here. Then he decided to come up here and run here. I don't know why he's for All Aboard Florida, but maybe it is because his family would have gotten business, or as Beverly wants to say, because he's gotten contributions. I think it's because he does not know this district, a district I've lived in for almost 30 years.
Mr. Sessom.